So, hey, I'm Ricky. I'm a pastor, and this is my friend Ryan Gardner. He's a youth pastor. Good guy, man. I'm going to get his take on an article I found on the Gospel Coalition website. And the name of the article is Jesus on Every Page. 7 reasons to study your Old Testament. I think we all would agree. I think I read in this article, he guesses that about 10% of people's Bible reading is located in the Old Testament. And then if you take the Psalms and Proverbs out of that, you're probably down to like 5% or less.
Yeah.
So I want to get Ryan's take on these 7 reasons to read the Old Testament. The first one is that the Old Testament reveals Christ. Is there any way you can see right off the top of your head that the Old Testament reveals Christ?
Yeah. Well, you look at the timeline of humanity, right? The timeline of humanity being from creation to cross to coming, to the returning of Christ. And so if we look at the middle of that, everything is centralized to the cross. And so we look at the Old Testament, and we obviously have the Old Testament prophecies, and the coming of a Redeemer, of a new Redeemer, and that promise of the Messiah. And there's always rest in that promise of the coming Messiah.
That's good,
and so, yes, I think there would be a centralized theme throughout the Old Testament that the law is not enough, that the law does not fulfill this promise of redemption. And we find that promise in Christ. So I think so. I think if we were to look at the Old Testament, we could absolutely see a lot of Christ. And you have the theological implications, but ultimately, I think there is a promise of the Messiah.
Yeah, he is revealed ahead of time in the Old Testament, right?
Absolutely.
Man, that's good stuff. To your point, I heard you mention the word theology. To his second point, he says that the Old Testament is a sort of dictionary for Christian theology. It gives us perspective on redemption, what a Messiah is. Have you ever thought about that the Old Testament gives us some sort of perspective on Christian theological words we see in the New Testament?
It would almost have to. Because I think if you look at the Old Testament and the imagery that's used in the Old Testament, I mean, look at the types of Christ. I mean, you have Noah and the ark being a type of Christ. You have
define type for me.
Okay, a type would be just kind of an illustration as Christ, and so the ark is the saving redemption of Noah and his family, where Christ is our saving redemption. So there are multiple different types throughout the Old Testament that ultimately, like we said earlier, point back to Christ. And I think a lot of those things help us define the importance as Christ as the Messiah in the New Testament. I don't think we would truly understand Jesus as our Messiah unless we look to the inadequacy of the law in the Old Testament.
Side note here, we may chop the video here. You mentioned Noah being a type of Christ, that redemption tool being the ark. What's really cool, that brought to my mind about this idea of individual salvation. But really that individual work of salvation is meant then to benefit others, to usher in the kingdom of God through our priestly roles. And so it was just cool that you mentioned that, but then Noah saved humanity. Or he was, in a sense, I'm saying his seed. He was the beginning to repopulate the world. May cut that one out.
Okay.
Sorry, man.
That's all right.
The third one, now this one's tricky to me. We have to qualify some of this, and he does in the article. In fact, I need to say who he is. Bill Murray. David Murray, I'm sorry.
Bill Murray. Still a great theologian there. I love
no
his work
doubt.
At Caddyshack.
Yeah, that's good, man. The third one, the Old Testament is a manual for Christian living. Now he's highlighting 10 moral principles. You can probably guess which one.
The Decalogue, yeah.
Yeah, but he doesn't use that inflammatory phrase, 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
But inflammatory. I hope you get what I'm saying. So let's go on with that one. Man, this one's so cool, and this is why I love preaching from the Old Testament. Going to be doing that this Sunday. The Old Testament presents doctrine in story form.
Oh, absolutely. This is by far, and I want to sit here for a second. This is by far my favorite aspect of the Old Testament, is that God works through story, right? He works through the narrative in people's lives. Just recently, I was encouraged to look at the life of Joseph and his relationship to Pharaoh and the years that it took Joseph to get to the point of, I would say, humility and perspective with God. You don't get that if it's not a narrative. So I think God works so entwined, so intentionally through the narrative in people's lives that you look throughout the entire Old Testament. You look through the narrative of Job's life. You look through the narrative of Isaiah's life and Jeremiah's life and the lament and the pouring out that he had over Jerusalem. I mean, there's so much of a story that's plugged into that. I love the Old Testament specifically for that reason. I think God was very intentional about making it extremely narrative, not to focus on their stories, but ultimately to focus on his story, his redeeming love.
No doubt, brother. Even the grand biblical narrative.
Yeah.
There's the big narrative, and then these smaller narratives, a national narrative, an individual narrative.
Yeah,
that is so good.
And the political narrative, even, you know, and there's such a political. And we don't necessarily see this sometimes, but there was such a socio-political kind of contention even within the playing out of the Old Testament, and we look at multiple different stories in the Old Testament where characters specifically fought with their government or even had to coincide with their government in order to accomplish God's greater vision. I love that. I think that's great. I think there's a lot of implications even for the local church even today.
Yeah, rather than offering someone, for the lack of a better word, just didactic teaching, just imperatives in sentence form, hey, let's look at this story, right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
see principles
that's how we
identify with characters and see ourselves in the story.
Yep, that's exactly
Man,
how we
that's so
learn.
good,
why was well, there's so many stories out there, but the one that keeps popping into my head is why was 50 Shades of Grey so stinking popular? It's because people wanted that story. I mean, people were looking for that love. They were looking for that story. And why do people go to superhero movies? Is because people want to plug into that hero. They want to plug into that story. I think in sermons, when we preach, right? When we preach, as soon as we tell a story, people are they're attracted to that. They're plugged into that. God has created a narrative in our heart. And so he's created a need for a narrative. So I think that's why we see a lot of that played out in the Old Testament.
Wasn't there a movie where a famous villain said to a young Luke, "I am your father"?
Absolutely. So and I never saw 50 Shades of Grey. I do feel like I have to say that.
Yeah, me either.
Okay.
So what's interesting is if you only saw that clip, you might say, or if you heard it audibly, you might say, "Oh, a father has a son."
Right.
And it's that simple. But really, isn't there more to that story
There's so much more to that.
But it's the narrative that gives that moment the weight.
Absolutely.
And man, we're going to be preaching this week on the idea where after the exile, the temple foundations are laid again, and the people proclaim in public worship that God's steadfast love endures forever. Man, if you don't know the Old Testament narrative to get to that point, you lose the weight of that sentence.
Absolutely, and there's so much to be said for context. There's so much to be said for the context. And you look at the Jeremiah 29:11, the passage is, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper." And the reason he's saying that is because these people, Judah is now under Babylonian rule, and what he's saying to them is, listen, you must prosper under this rule. He says, you must even pray for those who have you in captivity. So much is lost if we just use that as like a sending off verse for our college students, right? And so there's so much lost in that. But if you look at the entire narrative, that is Babylonian captivity, you really grab hold of why that's being said. So I think there's a lot to be said for reading the entirety of the story and understanding the whole story.
That's good stuff, brother. We're going to pause right now, and we'll pick it back up with the fifth reason we should be studying the Old Testament.
Awesome.
Good, man.